Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. So, what is fantasy? I took a crack at defining fantasy in my very first video for the channel, and please don't watch it in all of its glorious awkwardness. But I was inspired to revisit the topic when watching a recent video by A.P. Canavan on his channel, A Critical Dragon. And that video is titled Portal Fantasies and Defining the Genre. I will put a link to it in the description below. And I think it's a great question to ask, something that we fantasy nerds can kind of geek out over, is trying to define the genre. And this is, for me, the maybe not beginning, but part of a maybe lifelong dialogue. And it's something that I am going to enjoy, I hope, talking to AP about. And in the future, maybe we'll do a collaborative video where we address this. But I couldn't wait to react to what he had done in his video. As soon as I watched his video, I donned my tweed and decided, I think I need to respond to that. So here I am. Now, there are various elements that we recognize as signs of fantasy, as signs of the genre. It's a lot like trying to define poetry, I think. So in the context of poetry, there are certain elements that we recognize, such as rhyme and meter and different techniques like alliteration and, metaphors and that sort of thing we see as signs of poetry. But do any one of those things actually satisfactorily define poetry? And I think the answer is no, because you could subtract any one of those things and you could still have a poem. Therefore, not one of those elements is actually necessary. And yet, when you think about all those elements, they are, in a way, what we think of as poetry. And fantasy, I think, is very similar in the sense that no single element of the genre defines it, or is even necessarily present within it, within a given work of the genre. But these elements are indeed how we perceive that what we're reading is fantasy, not some other form of fiction. So I'm going to emphasize here that not one of these elements is essential. And I would have probably in my video 2 years ago, I was a little more emphatic and in claiming that some of these elements were essential. And I've gotten a little bit older and a little bit wiser, I hope. It's one of those things where I think the more you know you don't know. So that's where I am. I'm actually kind of stepping back a little bit, and I'm not going to say that any one of these elements is essential. And nor is my list that I'm about to put forward comprehensive. I came up with 8 elements that I'm going to touch on here briefly, and hopefully AP will want to discuss these in more depth with me and perhaps even disagree about some of them. So I anticipate a lot of fun in that regard. And of course, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you add to this list, or what would you modify? So absolutely in the comments, please add your thoughts. So what are the 8 elements that I'm going to touch on very briefly here? So I'll just list them first, and then I will talk about them a wee bit. The first one is magic, and then there is made-up creatures. And we also have a sense of the wondrous. And then there is the idea of portals, and that is what AP primarily talked about in his video, Portal Fantasies and Defining the Genre. So I'm going to just very briefly touch on that, although I think he did a fantastic job of talking about that in his video. Another one, number 5, the looming past. Okay, and then number 6, maps. I'm absolutely going to plant my flag when it comes to maps. I'm a lover of maps. And again, I'm not saying it's essential, but I'm saying that it is an element. And I will explain what I mean when we get there. And then number 7, I want to talk about language. So language is a pretty important element, whether we're talking about the actual prose of the book, of the story, or we're talking about languages within the story. I would say that languages are an extremely important component of fantasy, and one of the means by which we know we're in a fantasy. And then finally, archetypes. And AP and I have talked a lot about archetypes. We have an entire series of 17 videos. 17 videos about archetypes and various archetypes that are common to fantasy. You can find that, by the way, on my channel in the playlist. I have a playlist that is dedicated to the archetype discussion series, so if you're curious about what we've done there. At any rate, let's talk about these 8 elements. So let's start with magic. And I think that when most of us think about fantasy, it might even be the first one we come up with, magic, right? In the same way that perhaps the other famous form, or one of the other famous forms of speculative fiction, science fiction, includes technology. Fantasy includes magic. And one of the things that is required, I think, when dealing with magic is that famous phrase that Samuel Taylor Coleridge who coined it anyway, but it is the suspension of disbelief. So for us to be immersed, engaged in the story, in the magic, we are required to suspend our disbelief, meaning we know, if we step back from the story, that this is not part of the real world, the world that we live in. It is in some way very different. It is beyond explanation. Magic is ultimately beyond explanation. And yes, I'm quite aware that there are many forms of magic within fantasy, many magical systems, and some that lean toward hard magic and others that are soft magic, and the soft magic just revel in the mystery of magic, whereas the hard magical systems tend to at least put forward a seemingly scientific or a pseudoscientific explanation. Ultimately, I think even when you peel back the layers of scientific or pseudoscientific explanation, you're going to have to take that imaginative leap, and you're going to have to suspend your disbelief in order to believe in the magic. And that is something, by the way, that I think is common to perhaps all of these elements that I'm putting forward, the suspension of disbelief. So, magic, I think, is a big one. Does it have to be there? I don't think so. I don't think that you have to have magic necessarily to have a fantasy. I'm actually kind of stumped to come up with a fantasy that does not have magic, so you might help me out on that. Perhaps, I don't know, magical realism. Anyway, yeah, you'll come up with something perhaps there. But I don't think necessarily, in theory, you must have magic, because you could have all these other elements that I'm about to touch on, and I think fairly describe it as a fantasy. So if you have made-up creatures and a sense of the wondrous, and you have perhaps a portal, or you have a keen sense of the past, and of course maps, all that stuff, if magic is absent, is it disqualified as fantasy? I don't think so. Well, anyway, let's go on to number 2, made-up creatures. And I think very similar to magic, this requires, in many cases, the suspension of disbelief. Many creatures, such as dragons, for example, we all are familiar with the fact that it is physically impossible for dragons to exist, at least dragons that fly, right, and spit fire. We know this, okay? We don't need to be told that. We know, and we are capable of using our imaginations and suspending our disbelief to believe, while we're in the story, in dragons. And I think that these made-up creatures, in some way, meet a deep-seated psychological need, that they can be transformative in terms of how we see the world that we're in. So when I read about Lothlorien, I take a walk in the woods behind my home, and I see that forest in a new way, in a keener way. I appreciate it with more depth. So in that way, magical creatures help us to appreciate our fellow creatures in this world. That is just one thing that they can do. And must you have made-up creatures? No, I think not. Just like with magic. I think that you could have a fantasy with all just horses and dogs and all of that, without dragons. Although I would miss the dragons, but there you go. I think it is certainly feasible to have that sort of story. So, a sense of the wondrous. Now, is this essential? I actually, it is something that I appreciate in fantasy, but I think there's plenty of fantasy that does not impart a sense of the wondrous, that has magic and magical creatures, etc., but maybe, particularly I'm thinking of maybe grimdark, right? Is that so concerned with a sense of the wondrous? Often not. It's more concerned with a sense of alienation. So I think that is perfectly legitimate to say, yes, a sense of the wondrous is something you often find in fantasy, but it is not essential. But it is that thing that Tolkien referred to as the realization of imagined wonder. And it transports us. And it helps us, as Stephen Donaldson puts it in his essays on epic fantasy, to feel a sense of reintegration, to feel that we are connected to the world around us, that we have meaning in a world that often tells us that we don't. So that is something I think that is a beautiful thing about fantasy, that sense of the wondrous, that it can not only, while we're in the story, feel that sense, but also reinvigorate our sense of the magic, and that's in quotes there, in the world around us, our appreciation of the beauty in the world around us. So, okay, number 4, the idea of a portal. And this is not, again, essential. You have fantasies that are very much portal fantasies, as AP pointed out in his video, like C.S. Lewis's The Narnia Chronicles. A different sort of fantasy would be Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And AP, I think, rather cleverly pointed out how there is a kind of portal in the sense that when the hobbits leave the Shire, they cross a river into the bigger, broader world. So they leave the womb-like space of the Shire and end up in this dangerous place where they are required to grow in the kind of classical now sense that Joseph Campbell talks about in A Hero with a Thousand Faces. So the hero's journey sort of thing. But the idea of a portal is pretty prominent in fantasy, right? This idea of being in between worlds, of leaving the familiar to enter into the strange. And so the idea of liminality, right? The liminal, being on the threshold. Limin, I think, literally means in Latin threshold. So you're crossing this boundary. You're leaving the safety of the home into the big world. And so that is something you often do see in fantasy. Yes, I think so. And it is very important in terms of the growth you see in the character, and also the perhaps eventual return of the character having been transformed by the journey. So the return home, where the character may have an important role to play. So that is something you often do see in fantasy. But the idea of portals, being in between worlds and that sort of thing, definitely important to fantasy. Next, number 5, the looming past. This is one of my personal favorites, but I will grant that it is not necessary to fantasy. There are plenty of great fantasies where this is not really that present. But a lot of my favorites do have this keen sense of historical and even mythological layers that are underlying the story of the present and giving it depth and giving it the ability to have the reader be immersed in this world. And often there seems to be some kind of an apocalypse between that ancient past and the present of the story, as if there was some great civilization that has been ruined and destroyed, and there are these tiny remnants of it that are mostly buried, little hints of it here and there, and that the people of the present of the story feel a sense of being lesser than that great past. That is something that is very prominent. But whether or not that apocalyptic scenario is present, there often is that sense of the past. And I think fantasy does really often look backward, that there is a sense of life's fleetingness that informs fantasy. The idea of dust showing in Old English, the idea that the contemplation of decay and loss and the mystery of the past and what was lost and that sort of thing. So that is very much a powerful part of fantasy. That is one of the things that lured me personally into the genre. And then there are maps. And I personally, this is definitely a personal thing, but I love maps, and I don't think I'm alone. In fact, I think I have a lot of good company among fantasy fans. Are they essential? Okay, they're not essential. But I think maps are more than just a page in the book. In contemplating a map in a fantasy book, I feel as though I'm entering this other realm. That the map is in a way, I mentioned portals a moment ago, the map itself is a portal that helps me to enter this world as I'm looking at these strange names on the map, and I'm looking at the topography of it and where the characters are going to go on their journeys. I'm entering that world by looking at the map. That's why I always look at the map before I even start reading a given fantasy. And if there is no map, I'm always a tiny bit disappointed because I want to know about this other world that I'm about to enter. I want to have a sense of that place. I want to be rooted in it before I join the characters on that journey. So I think that maps are very much related to all these other elements, the suspension of disbelief, we're in another world, the idea of the realization of imagined wonder, the sense of the strange and the bizarre and the different. So it certainly, I think, is an element that can reinforce all of that beautifully. And I mentioned these strange words that you see on a map, and that is related to number 7, the idea of language. And saying that, I mean the prose of the story itself, which is often, though not necessarily, archaic, and also languages within that world, because having these made-up languages is another sign that we're in a different place, that we're in an imagined place, a place of wonder, a place that is exotic and interesting, a place where we can have adventures. So, I think in both senses, they lend to the immersion. In both senses, I mean the prose of the story and the made-up languages. They give us that immersion, that sense of place. Ancient words equal lost wisdom. So that sense of the past as well. And often magic, and here you see how these things are all interweaving, these elements. Magic is something that I think often depends on this sense of ancient language, because a lot of magical systems are based on old words that only the few have access to in order to gain the true understanding of a thing. You have to know the true word for it, that sort of thing. And you see that all over the place in fantasy. So language is so important. And as Ursula Le Guin pointed out in her wonderful essay that I mention again and again, it's called From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, the prose isn't something extraneous to the story. It isn't some decoration. It isn't the icing on the cake. It is the cake. It is the means by which this world is realized. And it is important, I think, in that sense. Now, is it essential to have fantasy with archaic prose, etc., or prose that is different? No, I think there are plenty of exceptions to that, actually. Particularly if we're talking about something like Terry Pratchett's Discworld books, where he's kind of making fun of the genre even as he's celebrating it. And finally, we come to archetypes. This is something that, as I said before, AP and I have spent lots of time talking about. We have that series on archetypes. And I just want to say, in regard to them here and now, I think that the key thing with archetypes, whether we're talking about the mentor figure, or we're talking about the callow youth, or we're talking about the maiden, or we're talking about the old woman, the crone, or the witch, or whatever, there are so many of these archetypes. And they're not just limited to people either. The archetypes include people, figures who are characters in the story, but they also include patterns. And what they all have in common is that there's a sort of universal recognition of these patterns, of these roles, and that these are patterns and roles that a skilled writer can use, can exploit, can even subvert or invert even. And even a subversion or an inversion is an engagement with the archetypes. But what we have in common here is that skilled writers can use these patterns and these roles, these archetypes. And what they do is they find new ways to make us listen to old tales in the process. And I think that is something that fantasy particularly engages in. It's not that other types of literature don't have similar kinds of things, but I think fantasy revels in archetypes. Fantasy celebrates archetypes, readily engages in archetypes in a way that I don't think you see in other genres, except for perhaps myth and folk tales and that sort of thing. And I think that is one thing that ties fantasy very much to these older forms of storytelling. So those are my thoughts at the moment, at least my evolving thoughts on what fantasy is. And once again, I hope very much to have some dialogue with my buddy AP on this particular topic, but also I'd love to hear what all of you think about fantasy and the elements that I came up with, and whether you would add to those or modify anything that I had to say. Thanks for watching this, and until next time.